So first I'd like to introduce my fellow Brandy Zadrozny. She's an award-winning investigative and features reporter for NBC News, where she covers misinformation, extremism, and the internet.
That's very nice, thank you. I'm just so pleased to be here. I've never been here before, and I'm sort of in awe at all of you, so I will try to tamp that down and talk about my work. I report on misinformation, disinformation. What was a pretty small beat a decade ago has become very politically important and important from a public health standpoint. And now I covered the 2016 election and all the aftermath after that. I've covered COVID extensively, and now I've had a little break, which has been lovely, and I've got to sort of dive in on a podcast project following one singular piece of misinformation about a nurse who fainted in Tennessee on live stream, and the ecosystem of mis and disinformation agents who propagated a lie that she had died. And I try to follow the harms and just give, I think it gives a good look into what misinformation is, who it harms, who profits off of it, while also being entertaining. And I've heard a lot of talk about stories over the last couple of days, and that's what I try to focus my work on. So
Much, Brandy. And then next is Jeff Horwitz. He's a Wall Street Journal technology reporter stationed in San Francisco who covers Facebook's business and global impact.
I have been covering Facebook for 3 years for the Wall Street Journal. I got really focused on the mechanics of the platform and information distribution, which isn't just Facebook. It's fairly similar between Twitter, TikTok, etc. Although the nature of the product has changed a few things. Did a lot of writing about 20,000 pages of documents that made their way out of the company last year to us, and am now working on a book kind of about Facebook's belated discovery of what its product actually did and how it worked and the ecosystems that arose on it and how the company dealt with that once it figured it out.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And then next is Catalin Tolontan. He's a Romanian investigative journalist and the editorial coordinator of 2 daily newspapers.
Thank you for having me. My English rather rusty. I have to say first, I understand very well that it's a very strange article here. It's also perplexing for you. NBC News, Wall Street Journal, and the Romanian Sport newspaper. David and Aisha had the idea. It's too late to cancel this. But we as a team, as journalists, we don't take any credit because I'm here. The credit goes to our sources, to our whistleblowers. And I think the main reason is that 5 years ago, a guy came in our newsrooms, and he's a director, a very well-known director in Romania of documentary movie, and he told us, okay, I want to make a movie about journalists. And we watched this guy and we told him, okay, no way. Are you from the Secret Service? Are you from the CIA? No, please, think again. And after that, and the second thought was, for sure, no way. It's impossible. Because you as journalist, as the newsroom, you are thinking something like this about a movie. He will come with 30 cameras, with 100 people, with a lot of lights, like in a Super Bowl final, yes? It's impossible to work in this kind of habit, because we are always in the rush hour in the newsroom, we are always in the huge secrets there, even if are not so secret. But we come back to him, and after 5 years, he made a movie with 1.5 years, day by day, in the newsroom, almost alone. It was magic for us. And the movie name is Collective. The movie was double nominated at Oscars the last years. And I think the first motive, the reason I'm here, is this kind of movie, because this movie multiplied not only our work, but the journalistic reputation all over the world.
Great, thank you so much. And I think what's come up in all three of them is around sources, where do we gain access for information, and then how do we effectively disseminate that information through documentary or through podcasts or through social media itself. When I was reading through some of their preparatory remarks, a little bit of alliteration started happening in my head, and I thought, really, there's 3 T's here that we need to be thinking about, and that's truth, trust, and transparency. And so today the questions are really going to focus at the intersection of truth, trust, and transparency to see if there's any hope for us moving forward into a direction where we can actually redeem some of those qualities. So one of my first questions is around, each of you are doing really incredibly impactful work to uncover dis and misinformation and the role of powerful institutions, not just the public sector, but the private sector. Platforms in the United States and globally are extremely impactful at shaping democracy. What is the greatest challenge you face in doing your work? And I'll let whoever wants to jump on that question first go.
Being on Tucker Carlson. Honestly, I think part of it is, I think of the kind of work I do, the kind of reporting I do. There's this anthropological term called deep hanging out. And that's a lot of what I do in these just really awful spaces where, a lot of these people think that the world is a very dangerous place, and around every corner are pedophiles and people seeking to harm your children, and just not a nice place to be. And so that's already hard enough. And then when you have, the misinformation pipeline, it's pretty easy to track. It's not rocket science. You have these small online forums, and then you have, right-wing media, usually online, podcast stuff, and then it goes to websites, and then it goes to Fox News, and then it's complete, and it just goes over and over and over, and it's this feedback loop. And when you're caught in that, it's really scary, and it's just not a fun place to be. So that's what I would say immediately. But I think the bigger challenge that we actually face here is the hijacking of the terms misinformation and disinformation. It's sort of like the fake news problem that we had when we identified the problem of fake news at the local level and people making up fake news websites, and now we have that problem with misinformation, and it's just sort of lost its meaning. I think it does more harm than good almost. If I put out an article that says this is some misinformation, people are just automatically closed off to what that means. And then you look at Trump's emails, and he's constantly talking about the misinformation and everything. It's sort of upside down world with the terminology these days, even though it's misinformation and disinformation is a really easily trackable, findable, explainable thing. But because of some pretty smart tactics to turn that on its head by the other side, we face a big problem with how to effectively communicate these ideas in this world we live in right now.
Before we pass on to the next panelist to talk about the harms that you're facing, could you give us a definition for misinformation and disinformation? Make sure we're all on the same page.
Sure. Misinformation is, I think of it as networked, incorrect information that flows through some sort of network to someone else, can cause harm. Misinformation is like my mom saying, did you hear that the COVID vaccine causes infertility? She's telling me this not for any profit or to, uphold any state. She's doing it because she wants to help. And usually that's what misinformation is. Sometimes it's the Boston Marathon bombing, right? Something bad is happening. Oh my God, what's happening? Let's all crowd together, and that's participatory misinformation. So wrong information spread through no motive, or no bad motive. And then disinformation is the same thing, incorrect information, but spread with a terrible motive, and it can be monetary, it could be someone trying to scam you, it can be like in 2016, Donald Trump's slow seeding of misinformation about the integrity of the election to, increase his political power or something like that.
Great, thank you so much, Brandy. And then Jeff, I imagine that you face a lot of challenges investigating the largest social media network in the world with very powerful lawyers.
Yeah, I think there, in some respects, it's a very white-collar job that does not involve having to deal with some of the same people that Brandy does. So, I do think it ain't that bad. But I think that one of the things that's really difficult is the discussion of this stuff seems like it's still very based on, is this good content or bad content? And kind of Facebook's been very happy to talk about that world. Should we take it down or leave it up? And oh, gee, it's a hard call. Well, and I think the thing that for me, I've been sort of struggling to figure out how to demonstrate better is the line between, I think, a good example, like good definition between disinformation and misinformation, right? Like definitionally, it will turn from one to another along the way. And that perhaps the factuality of information isn't really so much the point first of all, it's kind of undoable at scale, and second of all, it doesn't matter if every single word I write is true if I put together an extremely popular Facebook page that is entirely about black men committing crimes against white women. Doesn't matter. Same thing, doesn't matter if the Hunter Biden laptop story is true or not true, depending on how it is being used and how it is being spread. And one of the things that I think we have generally not done well is sort of understood how much journalism and sort of the traditional outlets, government press releases and so forth, are no longer driving the bus. We have a steering wheel, it's just not attached. And that what sort of matters is the design of the communication system that you're operating with, right? So like, how fast does it move? What types of content does it preference? And in the case of Facebook, I think the thing that was really hard for them was discovering years after they had built the thing and optimized it for a very particular set of usage-related outcomes, understanding what it actually did. And it was pretty hard to put that back in the ball.
I'm really happy that it brought up virality and engagement as characteristics of these systems that influence the content and how it's distributed. And we'll talk more about that later. I have some more questions on that. But Catalin, you pushed back against systemic corruption in the Romanian government.
Yes, we try. We have been working in investigation for 30 years. And people trust us, because we talk about trust, because we have result. Result means for people punishment or jail sometimes, for the politician, for the corrupt businessman, for the corrupt officials of the state. 2 ministries in 30 years, 2 ministries and dozen of high-ranking officials went in jail after our investigation. Of course, not after our investigation, after the court, the appeal, the whole long process of justice. And more than $12 million has been recovered from those convicted. Every time we tell people it's not our credit, we want to give you the information, the facts. We are struggling to obtain this kind of facts for you, and this is for your right to know. And they say, yeah, you are right. How many years they go in prison? This time 7 years. Oh, it's great. You are doing a good job. Because they perceived our job as a punishment job. As a job with this kind of results. And we are struggling not to please with public, not to understand this kind of complexity, because it is not our job to put people in jail. We are a newsroom, we are not a courtroom. And sometimes the people exposed, the state, the mobs, the politicians, strikes back. Sometimes they threaten our families, which is more effective than threatening us. Sometimes they turn the state against us. Just last year, and this is an issue in the report of the US State Department for Human Rights, they issued a subpoena for me for an article. It's not about the sources, it's only about the article of corruption in Romania. They put me in a basement for their interrogation for 1 hour, but first, at the entrance of the prosecutor office, they search my backpack and they find some pills, some medicines. And they expose pills by pills in front of whole TV camera, because the TV came from this kind of events, a journalist in a criminal, maybe in a criminal case, and asked me, this is for what? This is for blood pressure, and this is for heart condition, and this is for press conferences. So, come back to the Facebook. They know this is not enough, because if they pressure you in this kind of ways, they only obtain rage. Not only about you, not your rage, the rage of the whole newsroom. Because if the state is against you, if the huge pharmaceutical company are against you, you feel stronger as a journalist, you feel stronger as a newsroom. And they think like this: what is happening if we turn the public against them as journalists? And we found in a criminal file of a ministry in Romania, the prosecutors and the policemen found the emails between them and them team. And the team was hired between 10 and 15 people every month to put commentary against our work, against our articles on Facebook first, but not only on Facebook, sorry, on the commentary under our articles. And they made this for months and months. And I remember this kind of pressure, because in every newsroom in the world, if you are under the pressure of a social network, it's very hard to believe in your work. You have doubt. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I made a mistake, I don't know. But for sure, we feel this kind of pressure. For me, as an investigative journalist for 3 decades, I think this is the most important risk in our profession.
Thank you,
To
Catalin.
please with the public, because this kind of pressure through the social networks.
This is directly going to my next line of questioning around virality and engagement. How you can fight back against platforms that are allowing certain stakeholder groups to optimize a narrative. And so my question really is around, we've had researchers, whistleblowers, journalists like yourselves really show that platforms are often optimizing for the radical over the rational. What can we actually do to mitigate that? Is it policy? Is it technology strategy?
So for Facebook and the research they found, yes, that is conclusively per Facebook's reading. If you ask the question, does Facebook accelerate divisive, angry content? Inside Facebook, no one would, they'd laugh at you because that question was answered circa 2017. It was pretty damn conclusive by the end of 2017. By the end of 2018, it was just like brutally apparent. And what can be done on that is that a lot of this stuff was, they didn't set out to build anything like that. They just set out to build something that would work for engagement. And incidentally, that's the same thing that every newsroom, including mine, has set out to do with its website and so forth. It's just we're a lot less good at it. And it's not, and there are humans in the machine, and those humans are slow, and they have sensibilities that candidly don't make sense if you're trying to maximize engagement. So, the platform just basically behaves. It was built in a way to sort of amplify the people who would use it most, produce the maximum content production. And it turns out that getting angry is just based on the human psyche, a really important part of that. And then likewise, that factuality is not really a big thing one way or the other.
Francis Haugen's words are ringing in my head right now because it will surprise no one to learn that a person who used to work at Facebook thinks that people inside Facebook should fix Facebook. And I know she has a more nuanced approach in terms of research and all of that. But I think that this is so new, this problem, and so we're always sort of asked what's the answer? What's going to fix it? And from the people that I talk to, it seems like there's a whole of society sort of approach here, where it's, yes, probably some regulation and some government intervention, and maybe that's opening the gates and opening up the black box and letting researchers in and having independent audits. But it also is, as you said, it's part of the human condition to be nasty to each other, and so a company is profiting off of that. There is a component, which is what I sort of try to do with my stories, which is I'm a former librarian, so I think that information literacy is really important. And hey, but the question is people do want to know, how is this getting to me? How am I getting QAnon content within 2 days, and I have not said that I want any of that content, and it's serving it to me as research that Jeff uncovered showed. Why is this coming to me? And I think that dismantling the systems a little bit and showing the pathways that this bad information travels to get to you can sort of empower people to do different things. I'm empowered. My dad left Facebook, and I know it's little, but he was really into it, and really into it in that way that worried me, and he's off. And a lot of people are off now. And some people have joined Getter or Truther or whatever it's called, Truth Social, and people are winnowing away, but there are people who are demanding, I think, different ecosystems of information, and I place some hope in that too.
It seems like, for me, the most hopeful thing that could happen would be some level of transparency and slowing down of the process. This does feel like it is probably as important of a change in communications technology as anything since the printing press, in fact more so than anything since the printing press. And I think there's a not thin correlation between that thing and several decades worth of war. So I think that a big part of it is going to be just first getting used to the proliferation and the development of ecosystems that candidly, you think of it like biomass, it's this is just a massive algae bloom right now. And at some point you hope that there will be the development of civil society and something that's a little more like an online actual ecosystem, as opposed to just biomass. And
if I might, this is quite opposite of their business. Their business model, yes, because they bet on the rage. Yeah. They bet on our biggest fear.
They don't. I think one of the things I'm surprised about Facebook is how little they understand a bit about their own platform, right? They maximized certain metrics that they could follow, but they didn't understand what they were.
And also the speed.
Yeah, and I think, and so one of the things that I think is, they were always increasing that, right? And so one of the things that I think is really interesting is that there is content quality does matter to some degree. I think one of the things that the documents we got show is that Facebook was starting to die, right? It's like, it turns out that, you know, go to the Florida coast in a certain time of year and, you know, the water doesn't smell so good, right? Based on like the algae blooms dying off. And that's kind of where the platform's at right now. And I think there's some hope that just there will be some sort of businesses will learn that this isn't quite the way, this isn't good for long-term health, but in the meantime, it just feels like it's trying to preserve, to make it move a little more slowly. To have Facebook be more like Facebook was sort of like 2010, honestly.
If I may, in the last decades, we in Europe, we made a anti-hate speech moderation system with public money, European public money, and we worked on this system for more than 5 years. With a lot of academic people, very good researcher, not only we as journalists. And we gave them, for studying, hundreds of thousands of commentary every month. Because we are a sport newspaper, we are in between the passion of the people, it's very useful for them to analyze this kind of reaction of the people. And we observe a lot of interesting things. First, only 1 in 1,000 people comment after the articles or on the Facebook. Yeah, we have a huge leadership, huge reach, and only 1 in 1,000 are in the mood to comment. Yeah, and in this one, only 20% it's supposed to be moderate. It's against the rules of civilized conversation. And the question is why we feel as journalists, as citizens, as humans, that the hate speech are ubiquitous. Because we are human. This is the answer, yes? And I can give you a concrete example, if I may, from this kind of misinformation, starting for the first day of the Russian war against Ukraine. On the first day, the Russian army bombed a civil building. It was a civil building near Kharkov. Kharkov is a huge city in Ukraine, just on the border to Russia. Huge means 1.4 million people, double than San Francisco population, yes? And the Russian bombed this city. Nobody knows why, because a lot of this population are Russian ethnical, they speak Russian, and one woman wounded, and I asked kindly Aisha to put her face, became the symbol of the cruelty of war. This face on the front page. In few hours, all over the Romania and all over the east of Europe, in Poland, in Czech Republic, in Ukraine, we don't know yet who, they send this kind of message. This woman doesn't exist. The bombing is a false news, it's a fake news. And the Romanian newspaper, because we read first in Romanian, that we have people speak very well Ukrainian and also Russian in the newsroom, and they made research in the other sites, in publications, in Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, in Poland, and they found the same, almost with the same word messages. You are the traitors, they say to us, because you use old footage from an explosion, a pipe gaze explosion 4 years ago. And you mix this kind of fake face of a woman with the old photo. And of course, we are curious, who can do something like this? or maybe it's true, we don't know. Yes? And we try and we search between dozen and dozen of fake Facebook account, one name. It was a former journalist, Romanian journalist, hired by Radio China International. And he put the same message as Sputnik. You know, Sputnik is forbidden now in Europe, yes? And the next step is, okay, we found something, but it's not enough. Let's find the woman, because she is the hero of the story, yes? And my colleagues found a woman. She's a teacher in Ukraine, near the border to Russia. And because she knows everything, of course, she's so afraid about her life, because this guy denied her life, not only about the bombing at the civil building. And we put the questions, of course, and she preferred to give us and the other newspapers, because a lot of other newspapers saw the same messages all over the Europe. Daily Mail, it's one example in UK, they saw also these messages in UK and called her. And they gave us, she gave us only one message. Now the video, yes, please.
Yes. Thank you so much for giving this example. And Jeff, your point that this is a wound, and what is the greatest disinfectant? Sunshine, right? How can we create more transparency? So I want to raise up a couple pieces of legislation. Last weekend, who in here knows that the European Union passed the Digital Services Act? A few hands. I hope more hands raise up, because that legislation will affect us here in the U.S. We also have legislation introduced in the U.S. called PATA, P-A-T-A, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which gives researchers, hopefully, gives researchers greater access to platform data. I will note that journalists were left out originally. It was only academic researchers at first. I do note that the DSA is opened up to researchers from NGOs. We'll see what that means when the legislation actually comes out. But I'm curious, especially Brandy and Jeff, how effective do you think this legislation will be at actually forcing the platforms to open up and make data available so you can do your work?
So the work that I do, especially around the election, I sort of, again, I'm a librarian, so I befriended, my sources are academics. They're the researchers who were, pulling Twitter data years and years ago and making these reports that nobody really looked at. And now, again, their work has become so politically important. And so I embed with them anyway. I'm not a data scientist. I don't really want the data. I want to be sitting by next to a really smart person who understands the data. So I'm super jazzed about this, because we've seen that YouTube has been a black box, and Twitter and Facebook's efforts to give data to researchers has been wanting and waning, right? And so I'm really excited about that. I think that sounds like a great plan. It's a good start.
If I can show can you see the testimony?
Start.
Которые меня сейчас видят и слышат. Так получилось в моей жизни, что я оказалась в самом эпицентре этих страшных событий, которые происходят сейчас у нас на Украине. Я оказалась жертвой ракетной атаки. Я действительно настоящая. И никакой не фейк. Многие не верят в реальность происходящего. Многие сомневаются в том, думают, что это какая-то постановка. Но чтобы доказать, что это правда, пожалуйста, посмотрите. Это реальные шрамы, это реальные раны. Я хочу, чтобы это вы видели, чтобы ни у кого не возникло никаких сомнений. Вот осколки стекол, которые остались у меня. Когда произошел взрыв, вот то, что осталось, так сказать, от моего глаза, он меня не видит. Попало множество осколков мелких в мой глаз. Я надеюсь, что зрение восстановится и все будет хорошо, но это не столь важно. Ко мне сейчас обращается много средств массовой информации, много журналистов с разных стран для того, чтобы я дала им...
That leaves her in a position where people who claim that she was not real, she's coming out saying, I am real. What comes after that video?
We understand that after this video, we understand, we and a part of public, of course, understand that, you know, we are thinking and misleading usually, like a lack of knowing. Okay. But I think this is, now it's all over the world, almost an ontological problem. It's about being. And this is for us a proof. This case is for us as journalists a proof. Because they denied her reality. Her whole reality as a human being.
So this is, I think, this makes a lot of sense for a publication that has readers who trust it and who that you're shepherding those readers, right? But of course, like, your readers are a tiny fraction of the people who would have received the original fake. And I think something that Facebook found very clearly is that, like, as much as the company loved to talk about how counter-speech was the answer to things, it was emphatically not. The counter-speech didn't make it to the right people, and it also had far less distribution. It turns out it's much less interesting to see a woman who was injured and has actual wounds than it is to see the exposure of a hoax about crisis actor stuff. So
they're thinking maybe the wounds are fake.
yeah, and so I think this is something where with the DSA and with I think there's an impulse to say the platforms need to do better at kind of preventing the bad stuff from spreading, and that was in fact the impulse inside Facebook. It's just Facebook realized they did not have capacity to do it. The state of AI is nowhere near capable of, even if you could fact check this stuff in real time, of catching up with this. I think Facebook, one of our stories was that Facebook probably manages to remove between 3 and 5% of hate speech on the site at this point. That's after many years of effort. And that's based on just like overall volume, so overall posts, right? So I think the question is like, there's some safety in centralization. So TikTok, for example, has fewer content problems because if a video goes big on TikTok, it has human beings all over it before it gets there. Facebook literally only started reviewing the top piece of content on the platform circa 2019. Like, they literally did not know what the most popular things on Facebook were. So like, I think the transparency is super useful in part because it's just like shameful how little they know, and this forces something there. But in terms of like asking platforms to get it right, like first that requires government control that arguably could be a little bit scary in a lot of contexts, India in particular, right? It's fascinating watching, the solution that we might want in the US if we trust our institutions does not seem like the right one in a country that is, at this point, single party power and has taken a really aggressive stance on what can be said, right? Much less Russia. So,
and we have the example in Myanmar. Myanmar is a state double than California, and they have a lot of problem there through the Facebook, because in Myanmar, internet equals Facebook. Yeah, the Facebook is the gate for the internet in Myanmar, yes, and they have a huge crime scene in the north of Myanmar, Rohingya minority there, and Facebook, because they use Facebook as they use in Rwanda in the civil war 40 years ago to promote the hate speech against the minority. And the response of the Facebook is, okay, we hire a whole team for moderation in our system, and they hire 10 people. 10 people for a double country than California.
So I think one thing, just with what you were talking about, so since the ability to sort of just catch this stuff in real time isn't there. The thing that seemed like it was, and because I think, as you know, the infrequent commenters, or rather the extremely frequent commenters with this tiny fraction, right? That holds true for every platform. Is that the most active users? First of all, they are like I think on Facebook, the most active female users in terms of posting civic material, 10,000 times more active than the average female civic user on Facebook. That was their research. And it's those sorts of stats hold up across the board. So to some degree, we have democratized access to the megaphone here, and it also turns out that the people who use that, not only does that empower the actual disinformation people that Brandy's talking about, who are doing this for fun and profit, it also just means that things are not going to be representative. And that's a hard thing to stop. The one thing that Facebook found repeatedly, and I think it's kind of like touching because there was also internal warnings ahead of the 2020 election, was they didn't have the ability to do, I think, a lot of the fine-tuned work that the DSA perhaps might require. The only thing they could do that worked reliably was just slow the damn thing down. So if you make it so that there isn't a reshare button, this is like the most simple example. You still allow people to reshare, right? You can, Control-C, Control-V, repost it. If you just simply take away that button, the prevalence of things that your fact checkers have found to be misinformation plummets. Just absolutely, even if you limit reshares to only 3 in a row. It turns out that, we knew this from before, the social internet. It turns out all those, for all the old folks in here, which I definitely counted for this, in this regard, Bill Gates is going to give you $1 million if you forward this email spam. It's the same damn thing. Those things they travel further and much further than accurate things, right? And so this was an ecosystem developed to just go as fast as possible. Even slowing down reshares, if you just slow down the top 10%, that would still reduce the spread of misinformation. So speed was basically, it seemed like the biggest enemy of quality.
Now you can't, as an owner of the account in Facebook, and I have an account as journalist in Facebook with more than 280,000 followers, which is huge for Romania, you can moderate the commentary. You can, this is impossible. And you have to make a conversation with the people and to explain that it's forbidden to be something like hate speech or nationalism or rage, and ask them to cancel not all the commentary but a part of the commentary with the hate speech message. And sometimes it's work, but if you have more than 200 commentary per day, it's impossible to search.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff and Catalin, for bringing up these sort of friction mechanisms that you can put in place to mitigate these harmful externalities. I'd like to ask a question of Brandy before opening it up to the room for questions. And Brandy, what I really appreciate about your work is that you humanize it, right? These people who believe this misinformation, they really believe it, and they feel like they're doing the right thing. Can you talk more about your work and that's basically how important it is to humanize it?
I try to write interesting stories that people will read, and that sounds really basic, but with a strong character. And, a lot of my stories are the same. I want to know how technology affects people and how these huge private companies have hijacked our communications and how that affects people. And so I look for a person who can tell that story. I've done that with a QAnon person who was a 20-something-year-old man, worked for TED Talks, and then after a year and a half of the pandemic and sliding down a QAnon rabbit hole through 4chan and Twitter, ended up on the steps of the US Capitol on January 6th. So that's inherently interesting to me. How does a person get there? And so I get all of his internet history, and I get all of his texts with family and friends, and I asked him to give me his life, his digital life for the last year and a half, and then I I got to interview his family and friends and just sort of painted this picture of a person. And a lot of people, you know, and I've done this with anti-vax, I've done this with free birthing communities, you know, people, women who have their babies without any medical intervention, no midwives at home or in a forest somewhere. But I think there's an impulse in all of us to say, these people are stupid. They believe in the dumbest conspiracy. Who in their right minds thinks that, you know, satanic cabal of Democrats in Hollywood and Tom Hanks are abusing children under a pizza shop? And like, yes, that's true. But as the last panel just showed, these insane ideas have permeated a large part of the conservative Republican Party. And so I think like understanding how people get into these situations is important, and doing that with empathy. People hate NBC News, like so much. And so if I can like paint a sort of empathetic portrait of somebody like that, I think it helps sort of other people recognize themselves in those patterns and maybe do better.
But I think it's the time to open it up for audience Q&A. So I believe that there are people with mics on either side of the room, so please raise your hand. I'm sorry, my question is for Jeff and also kind of Brandy, because Jeff, and excuse me if I'm misunderstanding this, but at some point when you were speaking, you kind of had said that through your reporting you had heard that Facebook's like internally didn't quite even understand what was most popular on Facebook itself, right? Is that not what you said?
No, that is entirely correct. Like they were maximizing aggregate metrics. They weren't even looking until like various parts of the company, like literally one part, newsfeed wasn't doing this till 2020. Like at what the daily top 50, top 100 posts were.
My question then is, I was wondering if then we could kind of look at the idea of crowd table with that, which I don't know, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with crowd table, but because that was something that was just like a huge debate on journalism Twitter as well, as like, is this accurate, is this not accurate, because it's only looking at public pages, right? But that is still a window into understanding this.
Yeah, so CrowdTangle was a Facebook purchased at the, I believe, summer, fall of 2016 tool that basically tracked viral content, and it was and remains one of the best sources of information in terms of what is actually winning a fight for engagement on the platform. And that actually was a part of Facebook. I wish I could say there was only one lesson where Facebook realized they had to pay attention to what was viral on a platform that basically was maximizing virality, but it was one of 3 or 4 different incidents in which like people realized that like, I mean, this is still happening, right? Like literally the last transparency report, softcore porn was the #1 post, like some Indonesian softcore porn operator. So like these things are they just haven't studied very closely, and you know, I think it seems very obvious to us, right, that like what's at the top of the chart should make sense, and that you should be clearly checking factuality what's at the top of the chart. That was not natural for the tech companies.
And CrowdTangle, for what it's worth, I don't know, I'm familiar before with CrowdTangle, but like all of the stories, not all, a lot of the stories that we wrote about misinformation, disinfo creeping up before the election and even in 2016, were using CrowdTangle data to say, what is everybody talking about? I had lists of like, these are my QAnon lists, these are my anti-vaxxer lists, these are my, you know, white nationalist lists, and I could see what everybody was talking about, and so because they were embarrassed about a list that the New York Times Kevin Roose made called Facebook's Top 10, which showed that far-right and right-wing commenters and media personalities were always the top of the engagement charts, they broke apart the CrowdTangle team, put them in various places, and have now, a person at Facebook told me, are intentionally letting it get buggy, intentionally like making it unusable. They don't want us using it. It's caused them more headache, which makes sense. They could just to do like YouTube does and not give us anything, and that seems to be where they very much like to be headed.
And that's worked out awesome for
Yeah.
YouTube. Absolutely, like people at YouTube will tell you that like they are so delighted that Facebook basically walks into the buzzsaw every time, and they just like they'll release quietly tweak things and then release it on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks later after Facebook's taken the hit. And that's but so I think with this stuff, like the push for transparency internally is pretty much, it's not doing well. Like I think at this point there have been successive departures of people from Facebook, out of conscience. They broke apart the civic team right after 2020. About a month before January 6th, in fact, they broke apart the civic team. So there's not really much hope for that happening sort of voluntarily, particularly inside that company. Perhaps others might learn from some of the mistakes. Like I think TikTok's done some things that are perhaps a little bit more cognizant of danger, just because nobody wants to be the next Facebook in this respect. But it's going to have to come from external. But that stuff, the transparency stuff is needed there.
And it's pretty clear that without a legal mandate, it's not going to happen, or it's going to happen in a pretty terrible, unusable way. Another audience question, please? Maybe here, we'll go to this side. I'm going to try to teeter-totter from both sides of the room.
Hello. Thank you guys for speaking. My name is Michael. I work for an organization called Mnemonic, and we work to document and archive videos posted on platforms like Facebook that show war crimes committed in conflict zones around the world. I wanted to ask you a question about the role, specifically with Facebook and Twitter, with these trusted partner programs, and working with civil society groups, how they may have helped Facebook or really created more or exacerbated the harmful effects these platforms might have, and have maybe provided Facebook or these social media platforms with a cover, for example, or the roles of society.
So deep cuts here. Trusted partners is, okay, step back briefly. We've all heard that Facebook knows everything about you, right? That's been said for many years. Okay, that is only true in the narrowest sense. Facebook has no goddamn idea about what you like. It knows correlations. Only in basically post 2016 did they even start having the ability to tell if something was straight up porn, which is one of the more static problems in computer science detection, because a dong still looks like a dong. From the internet, everything else changes, right? But so they you have no idea how, they're blind, right? They don't know what the hell is going on in Myanmar, for example. They certainly did not at the time. And so they have developed this thing called the Trusted Partner Program. And then there's also, I think, market specialists, which is kind of a variation on that, but in which they are basically asking human rights groups to try to tell them what the hell is actually happening on their platform. And then likewise, they use CrowdTangle internally for a similar role, which is okay, what is trending in this particular market? I think the question of whether or not their cover is, there's some element of that. I guess this is kind of are you an accelerationist on this? Because I know some of the partner organizations, they're smart and they're useful, and they are flagging things to good people inside Facebook who are oh shit, you gotta get that down. That's a very valuable thing. That said, it's obviously not, this isn't a thorough enough thing. And Facebook's very touchy about the partnerships, because they really dislike the idea that there are people that have a special line into the company, and can basically say hey, this thing right here is happening in Israel. We are very worried about terrorism related to this post, and that there will be some sort of special routing. But those routes do exist, and they need them because they are so blind.
Question to the side.
Hi, thanks so much. So this is a question pretty much for everyone. I wonder, what are your tips? How do you go about fact-checking conspiracy theories where usually the most popular and the smartest ones have a grain of truth that is taken out of context, especially in you know, the current pandemic and just the constant scientific changes that we're battling. And I'm thinking about COVID, lab-created conspiracy theory that then became whatever it became. So how do you go about that, and what tips can you give us in the room for both fact-checking and writing about this?
Thanks. I think it's a good moment to talk about our responsibility as a newsrooms, because when we studied in the last 5 years the correlation between our articles and the reaction on Facebook, we observed this simple thing. When we put a stronger title on an article, near misleading sometimes, to be honest with you, but stronger, a radical title, always we obtain a hate speech, more hate speech volume than if we put a normal, a quality, what means normal, a quality title in an article. If we change only the title, we change almost the whole reaction link related to this article. And I think this is our responsibility as journalists to understand this kind of reaction.
You need not label it fact check?
No, I think,
You
no.
say that again, bring it on
It's
the
it's only about the headline of the article. Yeah.
And this is the internal research that Facebook does show. And the same thing for Twitter. If you slow down sharing of items that people haven't actually read, you also deal with more of a problem. This is the speed thing. In terms of I want to answer the question about fact checking and sort of how to do it best. There's two caveats here. The first is I think that an entity that has a sort of shepherding an audience that trusts them has a unique bond in that respect, and particularly if that's really meaningful. And I also think that there is a lot of value in doing what Brandy does, which is explain the mechanics of how something got crazy, and how it spread and what its effect on people are, just so that there's an understanding that this isn't just like trivial weirdos that think birds aren't real, although that turns out to be another project. But aside from that though, I would actually say don't bother. This is like definitely a wrestling with the pig situation, and you're not going to win it. Like if you had the ability to, the things that can sway people's minds are civil society, and I think that was one of the frustrations of the last panel about the election stuff. Is like, well, okay, how can we get people to actually like mobilize on this? That's not our job, and we're really bad at it. And we will lose. So
Yeah, no, I think there's got to be a moment where we ask ourselves, is it motion or progress, right? Like, what are we doing? And if, like this, for Tiffany Dover's dead, this one tiny thing, there were dozens of fact checks about it, right? And like, they didn't do anything really.
they drew more attention.
They did, and you know the worst actors will use these fact checks as a badge of honor, right? They understand the mechanisms and the way that we have tried to inject truth into the system, and they've weaponized those. So like when you have the pandemic video, right? That Judy Mikovits just banana boat full of like misinformation about the pandemic in 2020, and that came out. What they did was on their Facebook pages, they said 20 days till pandemic. Go to this website and check it out. No misinformation there, right? 19 days. It was a counter clock. Every single day from their Facebook page, they would send people. And then when they did it, they blasted it out on their Facebook page. You could see it on there, and they said, we are going to be censored any day now. And they used that censorship threat to promote that video. And so it's just, I think fact checking works on a spectrum, and there's I think of that video as verification more than fact checking, which I know may be a small difference, but like Jane Litvinenko used to be from BuzzFeed, when there was like an emergency or some sort of natural disaster, a hurricane came, she would take, you know, this famous one that was like a shark coming through a city, right? And she's like, no, this is misinformation, cross it out. And so that answers an immediate question. But when you have like squishier issues like the origination of this coronavirus that nobody knows the answer to, a 300-word fact check calling it misinformation is just unhelpful.
And the ecosystem has changed so that, sometimes it's good to get fact checked and taken down if you're doing this stuff. I mean, I think there are certain publications just seem to have a really hard time not profiling serial liars, just because, they're fascinating, but, then things just go to the moon. There's the ecosystem that builds up is what matters. What actually the people so how exactly do the people who are doing the Wuhan, China virus, this is the thing, the lab, who knows? Probably not, but who knows? The problem was though that it wasn't the factuality of information, that wasn't the problem. It was that it was being used as basically a sort of national, nationalistic, kind of blame deflection / let's get everyone worked up in a different direction rather than pandemic response issue. And so factuality, these guys can't stay inside.
Factuality is the key, because I'm not crazy and I don't give advice to you because you are more advanced than us in East of Europe in media, but we observe this kind of, if you are normally a journalist, you attract this kind of fake news and attack on you, because if you are normative means you have to you should do this, but you are more narrative journalist, they stay for a while on the facts. And I think this is our duty to create this kind of habit in our articles.
I think we can take one very quick question from the audience, and then we're going to end on a little lightning round of questions. Yeah.
Hi, a quick one. Is there a methodology for benchmarking speed check for Facebook, for example, in order to monitor that from the outside? If we would try to push a regulation saying sharing can only happen at this maximum speed or should be capped off, can we go and monitor that?
So some of it's some of it's just UX design. So this was kind of an important dynamic inside Facebook is that there's the kind of growth arm, which is to say the big arm, and then there's the integrity arm, and so one thing that the companies had, it's not just the algorithm, right? It's also a lot just the question of product features. So for example, originally you could add people to Facebook groups if you just had their contacts or they were your friends without ever them actually acceding to that. Goddamn nightmare. Okay, so the integrity people win this battle, roll it back. Then, of course, the growth people are like, geez, that really sucked. We lost a lot of growth is down. How do we fix this? I know. Let's make it so that you can invite people into the groups, and then the post will automatically show up in their feed before they've said yes or no. And then, if they just even engage or comment once or like the post, then they've pretty much joined, right? So they did that, and also a shit show. And so it's not just that, but it's it's not just sort of the speed, but it's product design, and it's kind of hard to measure all of that. You can see how quickly things are moving externally via tools like crowdsource. CrowdTangle, but those guys are awesome. But it's very hard to sort of, without access to company data, to actually see what's meaningful and what's not, and where rolling back virality is needed.
Thank you for bringing that up earlier on the role of research, and I just want to point out the Nudge Act introduced by Klobuchar that would support more research on whether or not these friction mechanisms will actually be beneficial at promoting pro-social behavior. So for each of you, in a 30-second or less response, today we opened up our panel discussion talking about some of the barriers that you face. I want to try to end on a positive note. So where do you see positive progress happening? We'll just go down the line. Let's try it.
I'm sorry. I think people are a lot better informed about the mechanisms that that populate their feeds, whatever the platform may be. So people are a lot more aware that like someone with levers is deciding what we see, who we interact with, what groups we join, what we feel about politics, what articles we read, and what we buy. And I think with that empowerment comes, and next is a decision, right? Do I want to be a part of whatever platform I'm on that's making me look at this stuff?
Great, so maybe awareness driving action. Jeff, quickly.
The conversation in DC about this stuff has gotten slightly less dumb. Other than that, no, seriously, just focusing on engagement and system design, like that people perhaps might be a little more understanding of the idea that you shouldn't focus on individual content decisions, whether it's taking down Donald Trump's account or whatever, like they don't matter. They just, I mean, I'm not saying completely don't matter, but they mostly do not matter. But in terms of overall like attitude and optimism, like I'm kind of just like joking before this that my takeaway would be like, please go buy a cabin in the woods if you can afford it. But so it's hard to be pretty optimistic that this works out well and that there isn't like, particularly given the pandemic and given office culture, given that, let's put it this way, given that office culture was a term for civil society, it seems like maybe a resumption of that might make people a little bit less crazy.
So maybe some informed political momentum.
And I don't want to go after the office myself, but.
And then
I
Catalin.
think the fight is so unfair, and I gave an example in Romania. They hired 15 people with $10,000 per month, and we spend for spreading the lies about articles and about facts and about corruption from public money, from stolen public money, for bribes. And we spend in a small newsroom in the European scale with 80 people, we spend millions per year to seeking the facts. And the effect is almost equal.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion.